Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Brian Daly. I'm the chair of special events for the USS Hyman G. Rickover Commissioning Committee and the co-chair of at 65 West, the club's public affairs forum. On behalf of my associates with both organizations, welcome to the clubhouse. We're delighted to have you back here live and in person enjoying our programs, especially today's program with Dr. Jerry Hendrix. Since the founding of the club in 1879, with the express purpose of strengthening the ties between the citizens of the United States and its government of the people, for the people, and by the people, it has been the tradition of the club to begin its public affairs programming with the Pledge of Allegiance. If I may ask you to stand and join me now in that pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Today's program is presented in collaboration not just between the Hyman Rickover Commissioning Committee and the Union League, but with a number of outstanding organizations that serve both our nation and the veterans who have served it, including the Naval Submarine League, the Navy League of the United States and its 4 Illinois chapters, the Aurora Council, the Chicago Council, the Glenview Council, and the Lake County Council, the United States Naval Institute, the U.S. Submarine Veterans Incorporated, the USS Chicago 721 Club, the USS Illinois 786 Club, and Chicago 502, which is the support group for the U.S. Army's 502nd Regiment of the 101st Airborne Division. It's always an honor for us to join them in presenting programs like this today. We're very grateful for their support. Brief update on the boat. The commissioning committee held its regularly scheduled meeting last week. Excuse me. And at that time, our suspicions were officially confirmed that not even the U.S. Navy is entirely free of the kinks of the global supply chain. And so what we've learned is that the 5 boats currently under construction at the Electric Boat Company unit of General Dynamics has encountered different delays. That, of course, has a ripple effect, not unlike a postponed flight at O'Hare Airport. And so now we're looking at a commissioning date for the USS Rickover of April of 2023. We're all eager to see these vessels put into service as quickly as possible for the reasons that Dr. Hendrix will articulate in just a few minutes. But for those of us on the commissioning committee, well, there's a little selfish relief because there's still so much work to be done. The U.S. Navy will allocate $3.5 billion to build a Virginia-class nuclear-powered fast attack submarine, but they don't allocate anything to fund the commissioning ceremonies. And so that's the work of our commissioning committee. And so we encourage you to visit the USSRickover.org website, which belongs to the commissioning committee. There you'll be able to track the progress of the boat. You'll also find an extraordinary amount of information about the officers and crew, about Admiral Rickover himself. There's a special section that my colleague Jeff Gray is specifically responsible for, which is he recorded live interviews with individuals who actually served directly under Admiral Rickover, and those personal oral accounts are available there. They're absolutely fascinating. We certainly commend it to you. And of course, no not-for-profit website would be complete without that little gray box that says donate now on that. And so if you're so inclined, on behalf of the commissioning committee, we certainly appreciate whatever support you're able to provide. Also, I want to let you know that there is a ship store at that website if you're interested in ordering hats or cups or challenge coins or the Blend 795 sparkling wine. All of that can be found on the website. The other thing I want to mention before we get into the formal program is that in the next few days, please keep your eyes on your email inbox because you'll be receiving an invitation to return to the Union League Club on Thursday, March 3rd, for one of the most important dates in the Union League Club calendar, our annual George Washington birthday celebration. We have, since our founding, taken a day to honor the father of our country, without whose service, sacrifice, wisdom, courage would not have allowed the idea of the United States come into reality. We'll be reflecting on his contributions through the prism of Admiral Rickover, the father of the nuclear navy. We're going to have as a special guest speaker Dr. Mark Wortman, who, as I speak, his latest book, Admiral Hyman Rickover, Engineer of Power, is rolling off the presses of the Yale University Press. He'll be here to talk about his book in an interview with Chicago's own Dr. Charles Lipson, Professor Emeritus of the University of Chicago. He's well known to many of us, and I had the pleasure of eavesdropping on a telephone conversation between them on Sunday. All of us are in for a treat. So again, keep your eye on the email inbox for Thursday, March 3rd. We hope you can join us. Today's program has two parts. The first part will be in the capable hands of Dr. Hendrix. The second part is your responsibility. During his presentation, there are notepads and pens on the table. Certainly feel free to take notes. We also encourage you to write down any questions that you might have. Following Dr. Hendrix's remarks, I'll be coming around with a microphone. If you have a question you'd like to ask, please just raise your hand. And then when I come to you, I'll ask you to stand and give your name and to ask your question. And in the absolutely inviolate rule here at the Union League Club, I will hold the microphone. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming to the dais Dr. Jerry Hendrix.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I said that I would talk a little bit about a recent visit that I had to Groton and to Quonset Point. I was asked, along with a number of other people from Washington, D.C., who serve in the think tank and defense analysis community, to go up there by the company about 2 months ago now in December. So we flew up there and had a chance to spend the entire day. So I saw the Rickover in the water. She looks good. Obviously, they're continuing to fit her out in the insertion of certain key capabilities and systems, radios, radars, etc., into her as she's there pierside. But I also got to see the construction of 5 of the Virginia-class submarines in various states of construction, as well as the first of the Columbia-class ballistic missile submarines. And I have to tell you, as a historian and as a defense analyst, it was a truly amazing trip for me. The breakthroughs that Electric Boat have made in how they construct submarines are really earth-shaking. In the past, and I was able to walk through the various different large warehouses there where the Los Angeles class submarines were constructed. And at that point in time, and the LAs were the most advanced boats in the world, and to, for that matter, remain amongst the quietest and most advanced boats in the world to this day, to those that still remain on active duty. But they were constructed in ways, essentially in long railroad tracked impressions, in the bays, and they were constructed from the keel up. Sort of like what we do every other type of ship in the U.S. Navy, where we lay the keel, then we build the ribs, and then we lay the stays, and then we weld the sheets of metal onto the sides. And that's the way the Los Angeles class were constructed. These new boats, the Virginias, are being built in a new way, a vertical construction method, where the sections, approximately 20 to 30 feet of steel, like a large donut, are laid there on the cement, on platforms, hydraulic platforms, and then the decks are constructed on other platforms. The decks are there that they can be flipped so that the workers can get at the most difficult to place locations on them to put in new pipes or wires or cables, and in the most gravitationally accepted way. And then once the decks are completed, those decks are vertically lifted and then dropped in vertically into these tubes. And so the sections of both the Virginia class as well as the Columbia class are built in this vertical assembly method, and then ultimately are then taken and then shifted horizontally and then welded together with the most advanced welding techniques in the world. It takes 2 years to certify a nuclear trained welder who can make the most perfect of welds. And yes, it's true that they are aided by computers and by robots, but they have to be observed by men and women. That's a most impressive, diverse workforce there. And then that brings together and to create something like the Rickover as she sits there in the water. I've been privileged to be associated in an oblique way with the submarine community throughout most of my career. First half of my career, I was a P3 naval flight officer, so I spent most of my time tracking submarines and getting ready to attack them. The second half of my career, as I became a strategist and an analyst, I began to look at them as strategic assets on a board. And then in the final phase of my career as the Director of Naval History at the U.S. Navy's History and Heritage Command in Washington, D.C., I was actually in charge of the maintenance and upkeep of the USS Nautilus, our very first nuclear-powered submarine, which has just recently entered dry dock for her overhaul that will allow her to last for at least another 100 years without additional maintenance as we place HY100 steel on her, which will be resistant to corrosion. As she sits there in the river as part of the submarine's museum, she will continue to represent the proud history of the nuclear-powered community going forward. So that, I just wanted to give you a little report about your boat. She is coming along. She looks fine. There are backlogs, obviously, due to COVID that have caused complications, not only in construction but in supply chain, and we're going to continue to see some of the fallout from that. But that's not really why I'm here today. I'm here to talk to you about an argument that I've laid out in this book. A lot of people, ask, what did you do on your vacation? I think the new thing that we're going to be asking is, what did you do during COVID? And so this is what I did. I've been writing about naval history, naval strategy for the better part of a decade now. I wrote my first essay while on active duty in 1999. I continue to write critical essays. There is a reason that I'm not called Admiral Hendrix, mostly because I tended to want to be a little bit more bold in some of my assertions in the public forum, like challenging the validity of aircraft carriers. I'll never forget that weekend. It's nothing like working on a lawnmower in your garage, changing the blade, and getting your wife come out and say, honey, the Vice Admiral is on the phone. And it's like, why is he calling me? Well, your paper just came out. So anyways, when I got 3 hours of my day back because I wasn't driving into Washington, D.C. anymore, I sat down and began to write sort of what I was hoping would be my magnum opus. This book originally, so this is a copy of the book. Unfortunately, I didn't bring a whole lot of them along because I'm running low on supplies. The book is only about 114 pages long. Originally, it came in at about 250 pages, and I cut it in half. And you might ask why. It's because I wanted more people to read it. So I wrote this book essentially with my mom and dad in mind. My mom worked at Walmart. My dad is a farmer in northern Indiana. And the one thing I found is that in all the writing that I had done, whether I was publishing in National Review or the National Interest or in Foreign Policy or in op-eds in the Wall Street Journal or other local newspapers, is that we were getting nowhere. It was preaching to the choir. Everyone that was already convinced we needed a larger Navy was still convinced, but anyone who hadn't been convinced didn't care. So we needed to find a way of getting the message to a broader audience. We needed to talk to the American people on a more personal level about what navies mean. So hopefully this works now. All right. So why do I think this book and this topic is particularly important now? We talk about 355 ships, or 400 to 500 ships, or 313 ships, or 318 ships. I can tell you the stories of the last 20 years, and it all comes down to how large is our Navy supposed to be, and that's pretty much where it stops. And by the way, we're still at 294 ships today, and we're not getting any larger anytime soon. So these arguments about how large the Navy ought to be are getting nowhere, and I wanted to get beyond that argument. I wanted to get to what the meaning of these last 70 years of maritime peace really have done to us, both as American people and in the West. Why it's eroded our understanding of why navies exist and why they're important. Why they're particularly important in the West, within the Western Enlightenment nations. Why the United States Navy is crucial to the United States itself, what the role that it plays traditionally in our national life. And then why we need to challenge this concept of the assumed peace that exists. It was necessary to revisit this concept of the free sea, which we all know and assume, but quite frankly is under pressure today, specifically from China and Russia, who view the free sea as a threat to their core national interests. So after that, I wanted to explore how the sized American fleet had deterred competition on the high seas, and the point at which that deterrence began to ebb, and that in fact we invited competition on the high seas. And finally, once we have this all lined up, only then can we get to an understanding of how large our fleet should be, but more importantly, what the composition of that fleet, how many of what. You know, you can go into the kitchen and try to bake bread, but unless you put the right ingredients in the right order and in the right percentages, only then will the bread rise. So just talking about 355 is just saying I need to make bread without getting at what is going to be necessary to make that fleet coherent and whole. So the difference in perspectives. Our nation was founded as a sea power. And when I say that, I mean sea power, one word. A nation can use sea power, two words, to further its national interests, but it's very rare, actually, historically, that a nation would be a sea power. In fact, my dissertation director, Dr. Andrew Lambert, in the University of London, says that there's only 4 nations who have actually risen to the point of being sea power: Greece, Carthage, Venice, and Great Britain. He doesn't think that the United States was a sea power. I disagree with him. He still graduated me and allowed me to become a doctor. But the point here is at the beginning of the founding of this country, we were a sea power. The northern states and the southern states were dependent on exports of their raw resources to Europe, and they were also dependent on the import of finished goods, furniture, clothing, etc., things that they could only buy in Europe. So we were very much a seaward-looking nation. And also, it was there in our culture. We had songs about the sea. Our paintings were dominated by the sea. As Director of Naval History, I was also the curator for the Navy History and Heritage Command's artifact collection. I was curator for the Navy. It's a great title. I really enjoyed it. I had 241,000 artifacts that belong to the United States Navy, including its art collection, which was valued at $3.4 billion in art. Original oils painted of the Navy in the War of 1812 or during the American Revolution that have only gained in value. Unfortunately, they're beautiful, and I say unfortunately because that means that the Secretary of the Navy always wants them hanging in his office, and I want them always placed away in warehouses that are temperature and humidity controlled and that no one can touch them. That was the dynamic that existed. Unfortunately, the Secretary, he was my boss. So he gets the painting of the Java versus the Constitution, and I get nervous. But it's expressed in the U.S. Constitution as well, this idea that we are a sea power. How is it expressed there? If you go to Article 1, Section H, which covers the powers, the enumerated powers of the U.S. Congress, in there it says that the Congress shall provide and maintain a Navy, meaning that the Navy is a permanent existing entity. However, if you go the clause just above that, it says that the Army shall be raised and supported. The fact is the Army was looked upon as episodic, the Navy was permanent. the founders had a real fear of a standing army, and they put an injuncture in that we should not have one. But the Navy was there because we had permanent enduring interests on the sea for the country, and so the Navy had to be ever present. But things happened, times changed. With the crossing of the continent, which ended in 1890, Louisiana Purchase during the Jefferson administration, and then finally westward expansion to include the Mexican-American War, we began focused on land power continental issues. Then we had the Civil War. World War I, World War II took us overseas, and again, we became a boots-on-the-ground footprint land component. And then Korea occurred, and of course, most recently, you had Vietnam, and then Iraq and Afghanistan, which dominated my career. I will tell you, I served 26 years, 3 months, 19 days, all of them glorious, and I miss it still to this day. I cried like a baby the day I retired. But at the same time, I made 6 operational deployments, 5 of them to combat zones in direct support of combat operations. It was not a boring career in the least. But this also changed the strategic outlook of our country. The Cold War was very much a continentalist, land-based strategic dialogue between us and the Soviet Union. And we got away from thinking of ourselves as a sea power. And this absence of threat also caused what Seth Cropsey, who is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C., called sea blindness. We have become blind to the sea, and that's kind of easy to understand. When was the last time there was a major war at sea? When was the last time there was a major battle? I think you have to go back to the Falklands War, but in fact, there's been very few wars over the past 70 years, mostly because of the size of the United States Navy. But we have to tell the story about the seas. We have to become reacquainted with it as an American people. One of the reasons why is that 40% of the world's population is located within 50 nautical miles of the sea. If you look at that graphic over there, I pulled this down off a website, this is the global population density. Each one of those spikes coming up off the map is, the taller the spike, the more people live there. And as you can see, we are still essentially a maritime world. The human race lives by and large close to the water, whether it's the sea or whether it's major river systems or maybe it's the Great Lakes. The fact is the water gives us a chance to trade large amounts of components and commodities very easily, and humans have come to conglomerate there, whether it's for food supplies or just for trade and commerce. So 40% of the global population lives near the ocean, so we have interest there. There's been tremendous changes over the past 70 years. This is a travel density map of sea lines of communication. The redder that map becomes, the more ships are traveling. We have these little IFF codes, identification friend or foe codes, that are attached to every global commercial shipping vessel in the world. And so in every once an hour, it pings to a satellite to let us know where it is. It's for safety reasons and insurance reasons. But this is what we call an AIS track map that builds up over time. This is essentially looking at 1 month of travel over the globe's oceans, and you get a sense of how dense the shipping routes are become. So how dense are those shipping routes? Well, you know, you have a $95 trillion global world product today. 80% of that by volume, 70% of that by value travels over the sea. I would tell you another small percentage of that travels under the sea as we look at a data-based economy. So if you think that your phone calls or your bank transfers are going via satellite, they're not. They're going via undersea cables, and those things can be disrupted. This most recent massive volcano explosion in the South Pacific disrupted no less than 3 major undersea cables that suspended data flow from key banking regions to other key banking regions across the globe. We had to reroute those key communications around those breaks in the undersea cables, and it'll take us another 2 months to get those cables replaced. There's also been an increased specialization in shipping. So this is a container ship. You've all seen them. One was jammed into the Suez Canal, the Evergreen, that blocked up things for about 6 weeks and disrupted world supplies. And right now, because of COVID and sort of the backlog in shipping and cargo, there are over 200 ships that are backed up hundreds of miles at sea off the port of Los Angeles, but most of them are container ships. These are large ships with lots of commerce. They're worth literally between millions and billions of dollars of cargo on each individual ship. And I just want you to understand, you don't build a ship that looks like that, carrying that much value, unless the seas are safe and that they are free. You don't place that much value at sea at any given time unless you're pretty sure that it's going to be able to get from where it starts to where it ends safely. It's been a time of incredible change also in the globe. I want to point this out right here. This is the literate versus illiterate world population from 1800 to 2014. I'm going to walk over here and speak very loudly. This is the general decrease in it. This is 1940. Obviously, you see an increase in illiteracy because of the outbreak of World War II in both Europe and Asia and the setback that happened for humanity around the world. But then you see it peak here around 70%, and then it declines, and now we're down to less than 20% of the global population is illiterate today over this past 70 years. That's a significant change. This is the global population that exists in extreme poverty. Extreme poverty is counted as being able to live off less than $1.96 a day as an individual. Again, I'm going to come back here, 1945. At that point in time, we're right around 70% of the global population is in extreme poverty. Today, we're down right around 12% in extreme poverty over the last 70 years. This is the world GDP over the last 2 millennia. Flat, 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 flat. Even with the Industrial Revolution beginning to keep up, we start to see a slight increase. And then right here is 1945, the end of World War II. And then we have exponential growth of global world product over the last 70 years. So why? I submit to you that we've seen all these changes because the seas have been free and they've been open to trade, and we've been able to distribute the wealth of man more evenly across the globe, taking things for where they can produce cheaply in large numbers to places where they are scarce and where they are valued more, thus raising the global population out of extreme poverty, increasing literacy, and increasing the overall net worth of the globe, mostly because the seas are safe. This is a cruise ship. My wife wants to go on one. I don't find cruises to be particularly interesting to me any longer, having made several, but she says these are fun. You can put thousands of people on this cruise ship, and hopefully, if they don't have COVID, you can have a good time. But I just want you to ask a question. Do you build something like that? Do you invest that much, and do you put that many people on it if you have a fear of piracy or war or instability at sea? No. This only exists because the seas are free and that they are safe. So how do we create this concept of a free sea? Any lawyers in the room or natural philosophers? Lawyers are natural philosophers. So this is Hugo Grotius. He's a lawyer who lost a case for his client in 1609, but he secured a concept for all of us and actually becomes a precursor for the Enlightenment. So Grotius was hired by the Dutch East India Company to defend them in a case against Portugal. The Dutch East India Company had seized a cargo ship in Portuguese waters, and I put parentheses around that, because remember, under a treaty signed out by the Pope, half the world was given to Portugal and the other half was given to Spain, and that left places like the Dutch and the British a little bit peeved. So the Dutch had went and seized this cargo ship. Now, this cargo ship was quite valuable. In fact, there were enough value in that cargo ship that it was able to float the Dutch government for 3 years. So think about that. If the United States could find a ship at sea today that could float our government's budget for 3 years, you can kind of get the sense of the relative balance and things here. Anyways, they hired him to defend their right to do this. But Grotius does an interesting sleight of hand. He actually loses the case, so the Dutch actually have to repay Portugal for the value, but he secures the concept of the free sea. And he makes a natural law argument that essentially anything that can blow from one place on the sea to the other that's unimpeded by any type of land or geographic or other natural feature, that is a free sea. And it's granted by God in the same way that God allows people to trade on land. There was a recognized right of free trade between nations, that if a merchant came to your border and wanted to trade something, that you were allowed to enter that border for trade and then come back and forth. So he applies this idea of free trade to free navigation, and he arrives at the concept of a natural right to a free sea. And so he writes this down in a book called Mare Liberum, or the free sea. And he's arguing against another group that wants to call for Mare Clausum, or the closed sea, and extend territorial claims over vast portions. But Grotius's idea is upheld by the international community. And in fact, the concept of the free sea and free movement and free trade becomes a precursor for individual freedom and liberty. And so when the Enlightenment occurs about 4 decades later, the Enlightenment writers in France and Great Britain and Scotland actually come to Grotius, and they leverage his work to become the foundational basis for the writings dealing with individual liberty. And so we owe Hugo Grotius essentially as a foundational writer that adds to the Western Enlightenment and understands and creates this predicate for our understanding of free trade and free individual freedom today. However, just because he wrote it didn't mean that we had it. In fact, for the next 350 years, the oceans were quite dangerous. This is a graph that shows the number of naval battles over time. Now, this graph, it's in my book, and it may be inexact. I was only in the library 6 weeks trying to count up every naval battle that I could find referenced in the Navy's library at the Washington Navy Yard. So I counted essentially by decade a list of all the battles that I could gather from all the works of foreign writers that I could come across. For 350 years, there was essentially the sea was an area of warfare. The ocean was a battlefield. War, conflict, piracy continued unabated until 1945. But after 1945, we began World War II with about 400 ships in the United States Navy. At the end of World War II, we had 6,200 ships in the United States Navy. We built those essentially in 4.5 years. We built those in places like here on the Great Lakes. We built them on the Ohio. We built them on the Mississippi. We built them all along our coast, but we built them everywhere to try and defeat both the Nazis as well as the Japanese. And so when we came out of the war, the next closest power to us was Great Britain. They had 1,100 ships. But essentially no one else in the world could compete with us given the size of the United States Navy. We were it. We had established the concepts of free trade and free movement upon the sea based upon our overarching size. So what did we do? Well, we started to go out and police these concepts and uphold them as part of our global international norms. So the GATT Treaty, the things that we were doing with the Atlantic Charter. We, the United States Navy, were sent forth. We identified 18 maritime regions of the world where the United States had predominant economic, political, and military interest, and we began to rotate our ships through those. We created a new fleet architecture and structure. Prior to World War II, we were what was called a surge and exercise fleet. We stayed home with our fleet by and large. We went out every summer. We did a large exercise in the summertime. We did another large exercise in the wintertime. But by and large, we stayed home and we maintained our readiness. But given the size of the Navy after World War II, we started to rotate out. We started to come up with a rotational deployment pattern. We increased the number of fleets. We had 2nd Fleet on the East Coast. We had 3rd Fleet on California. We would surge ships out from those to 6th Fleet in the Mediterranean and 7th Fleet in Japan, and we would rotate. More recently, we have created a 5th Fleet in the Central Command, AOR, in Bahrain. We also are looking to stand up 1st Fleet in Singapore to do local issues in the South China Sea. The point is we came up with this hub and spoke model, and we got our ships out there and we rotated to demonstrate the U.S. had these interests and we were going to uphold them. Then it was a time, again, of amazing economic growth. So this is world exports of goods in the years 1948 to 2016. in terms of U.S. billions. So billions, so you see that that's 2,000 billion, that's 6,000 billion, and you can see the exponential rise in export economy around the world, specifically looking at containers and shipping. So I came up with this graph because I wanted to tell the story about when does the inflection point come where the other guy decides that he's going to compete. So the Cold War ends, we all remember that. I was there. I was actually in an airplane orbiting over a cold pattern south of Sardinia when Gorbachev, there was an attempted coup against Gorbachev. And he was taken prisoner at his dacha, and we all got real nervous at that point in time. We're wondering if the Russians were going to jump ugly with us again. But I remember the end of the Cold War. I was there at the beginning of it, or at the end of it, beginning of my career. But at that point in time, 1989, we had a U.S. Navy that was just shy of 600 ships. President Reagan and John Lehman came in, so we're going to get a 600-ship Navy. We got to 594, and then we won. So, of course, we immediately took a peace dividend. So in a very rapid order, by 1990, we had already sold off some 85 ships. We were down to 120 ships sold off. We got rid of all the Knox-class frigates. We're selling off things left and right to try and reap this peace dividend. We crashed through 400 ships in 1993, and this to me is the turnover point. We start to see changes in the other guys' foreign policy, what they're writing, what they're thinking. So we see the first known reference to China's assassin mace strategy, what we now term anti-access air denial, the creation of these missiles to push us farther back. Of course, we also had Desert Storm right here, which kind of freaked the authoritarian powers out because we had a policy of regime change that we had the right under the United Nations to come in and change your government if we disagreed with you, and they didn't like that very much. Then we had the Taiwan Straits incident, 1995, 1996, where China tried to intimidate the government of Taiwan during one of their election cycles by lobbing some missiles out their way. And President Clinton decided to send a carrier strike group and then an amphibious ready group through the Taiwan Strait, and that caused China to lose face. And they decided that they were never going to allow us to do that to them again. Then there was, of course, the B-2 accidental dropping of a smart weapon on the Chinese embassy in Belgrade during the Yugoslav campaign, which the Chinese don't think that the Americans ever do anything by accident, so that was us sending a message to them. That triggered them to invest even more. But as you can see, we're already by year 2000 to just down just over 300 ships. We crashed through 300 ships in 2003. We bottomed out at 271 ships in 2014, the lowest we've been since World War I at that point in time. Now, I will tell you, every ship we have today is tons better than any ship that we had in World War I. So apples to apples comparisons can't come down just to fleet size, because our ships today are much, much more capable than anything we've had in the past. But it's also true that a single ship can only be in one place at a time. And the Chinese have been building. Today, the Chinese have a Navy that's at 355 ships. Our magical number, they've met it. Their ships aren't as better, but they can be a lot more places than what we can today. But you can see this green to yellow to red is China looking at our decreasing size of our fleet and what I perceive is our invitation to them to compete with us at sea. And it's happened. So both China and Russia are continentalist great powers. They tend to look at the global environment from a land perspective. That's their history. And in fact, if you look at these maps here, this is how these two countries have grown over time. And by over time, I mean over hundreds of thousands of years. You have the Warring States period, 5 major Chinese powers here. This becomes the heart of China. But then they've added Manchuria, Xinjiang, Tibet over time. They always tend to look at the outsider, and they want to absorb that outsider, bring them in so that it becomes another defensive barrier or buffer zone for them. Whether it was the Mongols or the Manchurians, they reached out, absorbed them, turned their cultures to the Chinese Han culture, and they absorbed it. Same thing with the Russians. This is the Grand Duchy of Moscow here, where Russia begins, and you see their slow expansion over time as they dealt with the raiders from the steppes, as well as their expansion to include, during the time of the Soviet Union, looking at Ukraine, the Baltics, Romania, Bulgaria as essentially buffer space to give them additional strategic depth from the west, claiming that because of the multiple invasions from the Swedes and the Germans and so on over time, that they needed that space. And that is playing out right now in our newspapers today with a conversation about Ukraine. They are caging it that they require that strategic depth because of their historic concerns. Again, they're continentalist powers. But now they've turned those continentalist views upon the sea. They have begun to look at the sea as yet another barrier or buffer space which they need to add, and they make this argument in their writings and their strategic laydown. They need to add that so that they can feel safe at home, because the sea is free. They don't like that. The sea, a free sea, also allows for the free transmission of the concepts of individual liberty and freedom. Why did they have to crush Hong Kong? Because Hong Kong was an enclave of capitalism and free thought that had to be shut down, because that was a challenge to a centralized authoritarian rule. Why does Taiwan have to be absorbed? Because Taiwan is a Confucian society that has managed to be democratic and capitalistic and succeed beyond its wildest dreams. That is a threat to centralized authoritarian rule. Therefore, it must be absorbed. So they have invested in larger navies, but they've also invested in sensors and weapons. So this is the Antiaccess area denial graph that makes its way around DC all the time. These are missiles that are shore-based. They are ships and aircraft that can reach out to the first island chain. And then there are additional weapons and sensors like the DF-21 anti-ship ballistic missile, otherwise known as the carrier killer, that can reach out. And then there's the DF-26, which we call the Guam killer, because it has the range to reach our island base at Guam. This is the buffer zone that they are trying to create at sea to push the United States Navy back outside of the range of its traditional weapons, whether it's the Tomahawk missile, which has a range of around 1,000 miles, or the carrier air wing, which unfortunately only has a range of about 500 miles. They want to make sure that we cannot touch them from where we're at. So they built up this great wall at sea, as Admiral Harry Harris said just a few years ago. They've also decided that they're going to make additional territorial claims at sea. There was a caveat, a carve-out, in the original free sea argument, which was what we call the two cannon shot rule, that nations could claim territorial seas out to the range of 2 cannon shots distance from land. The idea was that eventually the cannon shot would be able to go a little bit further, maybe double the amount of space that then. Originally, it was about 1.5 miles, so the original territorial sea was 3 nautical miles. That was the carve-out cannon shot rule. Well, the Chinese are saying, hey, look, my cannon can go 1,000 miles. So can I not claim all of everything that falls under my weapons envelope as my territorial sea? And by the way, I've got this old map, the 9-dash line map from 1947, that shows that the South China Sea is my territorial waters. So therefore, can that not be my territorial waters, and that everything that's on it and under it with regard to natural gas or minerals, that's mine? The Russians have done the same thing up north. If you look at the Arctic Sea, which is now opening because of global warming, there's amazing amounts of natural gas and petroleum, as well as other rare metals and resources that are up there. And the Russians have begun to extend their territorial claims over the Arctic Ocean, contravening claims from Canada or Europe or even the United States in our holdings near Alaska. So both of them are expanding these territorial claims. The concept of the free sea is under attack in law and at sea in any given moment. Russia's investing in icebreakers. The United States has 1. They have like 46, 9 of which are nuclear powered. We're building new icebreakers now, but we've underinvested in our Coast Guard for years. And it's going to take us a while to catch up. So I've been trying to figure out how to tell this picture. You have to tell a story and you have to show it in pictures. How do you explain to the American people what it is we do? What is the nature of the concept of presence? How do you value it? I tried to come up with graphics to show what it is that the Navy does. And my first stab when I was working in the Pentagon was a sinusoidal wave, and that went exactly nowhere. But then I fell in love with the Fibonacci curve, and if you're a mathematician and you know about the golden ratio or the golden mean, and you see it expressed in nature and how it's mathematically expressed, this really tells me, this is actually a way that I use to convey what it is the U.S. Navy actually does So this is kind of what the U.S. Navy really does. Most of the time we're right here, we're doing naval presence. We're out there showing the flag, sailing, upholding our interests, telling our friends and allies, I'm here for you, telling my enemies, I'm here against you, telling my neutrals that, hey, if you need some help, give me a call. That's day-to-day, standard, steady state operations. Then there's a little bit higher tempo, global contingency operations, deterrence patrols, the ballistic missile submarines, our Ohio class, that go out there with their nuclear-tipped ballistic missiles, that if Russia or someone else decides to attack me with their nuclear weapons, I'm always going to have a second strike option that's going to survive, and I will get you tomorrow. So you might not want to jump ugly with me today. What about humanitarian assistance, disaster response, like this volcano exploding? Who's going to go and help these people out with hospitals and medical supplies? Generally, it's going to be the United States Navy with our Marine Corps, or our CVs, our construction battalions, or our medical doctors. I cannot tell you the number of times I have witnessed us pulling into port and giving a village measles, mumps, and rubella vaccines. And instantly, that village chief becomes our friend. Why? Because I've just taken his children and given 50% of them the chance, 50% more of them the chance to reach adult age of 18. I can't tell you how important that is when we do these specific partnership deployments every summer with our hospital ships, where we go out there and we repair cleft palates, or we do eye surgery for cataracts for the older people in some of these places that haven't seen medical care in such a long time. Sometimes we embarrass the local governments because they can't take care of their people as well as we can, but in the end, they tend to come back and become our longer-term friends and allies. And then this is what I call surge force, power projection. If there's a crisis that I've got to show the flag and I got to show it in a serious, stick waving kind of way, that's this. And then, of course, wartime. Wartime is when the Navy puts to sea and we don't come home. We're going to be out there for a long, long time. And you saw that in World War II, where essentially, I complained today if I had a 9-month deployment. Some of the guys that came after me had 12 to 14-month deployments. World War II, 3.5-year deployments were pretty much the standard norm. You got underway and you didn't come home to see the wife and kids until it was done. So what is that balance? So we tend to call what I talk about the high-low mix. High end is my war-winning capability within the United States Navy. It resides in my nuclear-powered aircraft carriers and their escort forces and their carrier air wings, and in my submarine force, like the Rickover or the 4 Ohio-class SSGNs. The ability to launch missiles from under the sea that no one sees coming until they're there. Excuse me. So, everyone notices when the aircraft carrier shows up. Presidents are always asking, where are my carriers? I always kind of figure, did a president ever ask, where's my frigate? I don't know, But they always say, they ask, where's the aircraft carriers? From the Suez Crisis forward, the nuclear aircraft carrier has been a prime mover of U.S. foreign policy. But I will tell you, one of the things that I witnessed during my active duty career was that we surfaced one of our 4 Ohio-class SSGNs. Those are guided missile submarines that can carry up to 155 Tomahawk missiles. We surfaced one of these off the coast of a major power, had the thing spin its radar a few times to say, hello, I'm here, and then submerge. And we witnessed that everything stopped in their country for about 2 days. They were so confused as to what message we were sending and what we were doing and what they had done wrong that they sort of just stopped and went into sort of this shock method. One of the reasons why that happened is because of Libya. When we took down Muammar Gaddafi a decade ago, we had the USS Michigan, one of these 4 Ohio-class submarines, surface and disgorge 118 Tomahawk missiles simultaneously, and essentially took down the Libyan military all in one wave. They really never saw it coming, and then everything else rolled in after that. You can have some disagreements whether that was a good thing or not, but I'm here to tell you from the viewpoint of the USS Michigan, they had a fine day. So that's your high-end force. That's your war-winning capability. So what's your low-end force? That low end is the day-to-day presence operation. We need to have a balance between high-end and low-end. I cannot have 355 nuclear aircraft carriers. The Ford costs $15 billion a copy to build. The new submarines are going to cost between $7.5 to $9.5 billion a piece to build. So I can't obviously fill the Navy with those. So I have to have a balance. Back home on the farm, so I was just over in northeastern Indiana with Dad on Saturday night. I went outside with Dad, and up in the pole barn, there's the 1066 International Harvester tractor. And in the springtime, Dad's going to put an 8-bottom plow beyond that, and he's going to go plow the fields, and he's going to put the disc on, and he's going to do what he does, and he's going to have a great time at age 77 playing with his toys. Well, what does Dad do the rest of the summer after he gets the crops in? He gets on his riding lawnmower and he mows the lawn. And he mows the lawn like every other day, because that's what 77-year-old men do, is go out and mow the lawn. By the way, he's got like a 5-acre lawn. So this guy's a farmer. He gets up in the morning, he's like, what am I going to do today? All right, so I'm not going to go out and mow the lawn with a nuclear aircraft carrier. I'm not going to do freedom of navigation operations. I'm not going to do low-end presence operations. I'm not going to show the flag every day, everywhere, with aircraft carriers and submarines. I need frigates. Frigates like the Constellation-class frigate that's going to be built up in Marinette, Wisconsin, that we've just awarded the contract to, FFG 62. And we need a lot of them. We right now are planning to build about 20. We really need about 60, because these are my day-to-day show the flag. The ship at the bottom is what the Commandant of the Marine Corps wants. He wants these amphibious ships, small, light amphibious ships that can get into small ports to work with archipelagic powers like Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, and cooperate with them in small, shallow seas and waters. So that's your low-end force. The balance between high-end and low-end, I'm going to show you what that kind of looks like. But the one thing I'm going to tell you, by the way, is this going to cost money. All right? To grow the Navy is not going to be cheap, and you're not going to get it for the same price that you're paying today. The U.S. Navy's budget today is around $212 to $218 billion a year. To actually grow the Navy will cost more, as much as $40 billion a year more. That could come from other places within the budget, or it could come from an increase, but I don't want to mislead you into thinking that somehow there's a magician's trick that I can grow the Navy without spending more on it. It's going to cost more in ships, it's going to cost more in the men and women to man them, and it's going to cost more in maintenance and training to keep them up. So, by land or by sea? The sea forms the basis of our national interest. That's what I've made an argument to you about, economically, diplomatically, philosophically. And our competitors across the sea have begun to look at these commons, the oceans, cyber, space, as the area where they want to compete against us. They want to push us away from their shores. This is where the competition is today, whether we want to admit it or not publicly. This is where the competition is today. And they are sensitized as nations, China and Russia, to their vulnerabilities from the sea. This is where it's going to happen. So we, for so long, have struggled to be all things to all peoples. We have tried to be a land power and a sea power, air power and a space power, and we can no longer afford to do all things. We have to make a conscious decision. We have to prioritize what type of national security strategy that we are going to have going forward. I believe that we need to pursue a maritime national security strategy again. What does that mean to become a sea power state? We need to rebuild our shipbuilding and our industrial base, and that is not just shipyards to build new construction. We need new repair yards. One of the reasons why 7 Ticonderoga-class cruisers with 122 missiles each are scheduled to be decommissioned over the next few years is because we have not properly cared for and maintained those ships across their lives. They are old, they are worn out, they've been beat up, and they need to go to the boneyards because we've used them badly. We haven't maintained them, we haven't repaired them. So we also have to create additional redundancy and resilience in downstream parts and suppliers. I cannot tell you, and in fact, I literally cannot tell you because it's classified, how many of our parts, critical parts for the constructions of ships and airplanes, are made by one manufacturer in the United States. What I really also could not tell you is the number of parts and critical supplies are made by foreign manufacturers. That the United States is dependent upon foreign nations for critical aspects of its national security. Foreign partners who have been, shall we say, unreliable in the past. Foreign suppliers, in some cases, who are opposed to our national interests. We need to rebuild our merchant fleet and our civilian logistics fleet, all right? One of the things, if you want to lower your overall cost of your Navy, rebuild your merchant fleet. In 1981, the Reagan administration made a decision to pull all subsidies for merchant fleet construction in the United States. Europe did not pull their subsidies. South Korea did not pull their subsidies. Japan did not pull theirs, and China certainly not pull theirs. So now they all own merchant ship construction globally. U.S. supplies travel on foreign bottoms and under foreign flags. If we become an export economy again, it would be really nice if some of our exported goods actually went on U.S. Navy, or not Navy ships, merchant ships that could be built here in the United States. So this is the Philadelphia Navy Yard. Those are two dry docks at the Philadelphia Navy Yard. Of course, it's not the Philadelphia Navy Yard anymore because we closed that and we turned it over to civilian industry. Those two dry docks can hold nuclear aircraft carriers, except we don't own them anymore. In fact, the USS Ford, which is just being built and will be deployed for the first time this summer, has only one dry dock in the world where she can go, and that's in Newport News in Virginia. When she moves around to the West Coast, she will have no dry dock. If she's damaged in a war in the Pacific, there's no place to bring her home in the Pacific to repair her. We need to make these investments. I mean, this is sort of national security 101, but we have forgotten it by and large as a people. So what do we need? So what do we really need? So, I put on my thinking cap over the last 10 years, and this is the Navy I think we need. We have 294, at the time I wrote the book, it was 295. We need a Navy of about 456 ships, and those are the types of ships. So I've given you a number, and I just gave you the ingredients for the recipe on how much bread we need to make and of what type. So we need 11 aircraft carriers. Some people would argue we don't need 11 aircraft carriers, but I'm here to tell you it's statutory law of the United States that we need 11 aircraft carriers. It's in law. If you're going to have 11 aircraft carriers, then you need 22 cruisers. You cannot deploy a capital vessel of the United States Navy without a defensive shotgun, as we call it. We always send 2 cruisers with every aircraft carrier. They then carry 244 missiles to defend that aircraft carrier from attack. So that's the purpose of a cruiser. So if you got 11, you need 22. Destroyers. Generally, we send out 4 destroyers with each aircraft carrier to provide air defense, anti-surface defense, and anti-submarine defense around it, a screen for that aircraft carrier. Destroyers are also used for independent operations to go out, do surface action groups, and show the flag operations in high-intensity areas. So how many destroyers I need? About 73. Frigates. Today I got 0. I managed to go from having 118 frigates in 1989 to 0 today. We're about to start construction of the new Constellation-class frigates in Wisconsin. We need to do that. We need to keep building them for a long time. After we get about the first 5 ships built and we get the final design solidified, we need to open a second yard and construct frigates elsewhere other than just Wisconsin. When we were building the Oliver Hazard Perry-class frigates in the 1970s and 1980s, we constructed them in 4 separate yards across the country so we could get them out into the Navy as quickly as possible. We need corvettes, which are the littoral combat ships. That's what I call them. That's their traditional name. Those are being built in Wisconsin. I need to maintain those. I also need to have large unmanned vessels. Unmanned is a key technology enabler for the United States Navy and other navies around the world, and we're going to need that. We need large, medium, and small unmanned platforms. And by the way, don't build them in the same yards where you're building your large surface combatants. If you do that strategic mistake, take the lesson of World War II. Build them on the Great Lakes, build them on the Ohio, build them on the Mississippi, where yards exist that can build ships of those sizes. Grow your industrial base, grow your workforce so that there's more spare parts in the country. Take this advantage to make sure that you may add redundancy and resilience to your force. Then I can go on down. Submarines. So ballistic missile submarines, we're going to build 12 of the Columbias. We need 8 guided missile submarines. So I'd like to add 8 boats on the back end of the Columbia class to get those guided missiles that can carry 155 Tomahawk missiles, or the new conventional prompt strike hypersonic missile, which is going to really freak everybody out when it comes out because of its range and its lethality. And then attack submarines like the Rickover. We are right now sitting around 50. We really need about 62 fast attack submarines. In the Cold War, we had over 100 fast attack submarines. We need to get our numbers back up because they are by far the most lethal aspect of my high-end war-winning force. And then I got the other things with amphibious ships and so on down there. Adds up to 456. I put this chart out there as an invitation to other navalists or critics to shoot me down. Oddly enough, no one's taken me on this. One of the things that told me this chart is right, as I was going back through the congressional record, in 2014, in testimony before the House Armed Services Committee, the then Chief of Naval Operation was asked a question, how many ships do you really need, Admiral? And he said, oh, about 450. So it's not 355. That's your minimum requirement to meet your minimum standards on it any day to day. If you really want to have redundancy and resiliency, you're going to have to get your Navy back up around 450. And then maybe you're large enough to deter the other guy from wanting to come out and be aggressive with you. So how do we do? What's the next steps? Well, this is one of the next steps, is coming to talk with people like you, because we have to have national conversations. We have to drive the sea back into our national culture. How long has it been since there's been a good movie about the sea or the Navy or about merchant trade? I mean, I'm looking forward to Top Gun 2 because I'm going to feel like I'm 19 years old again, because that's when Top Gun 1 came out. How Tom Cruise's character managed to stay on active duty for this long. He was only a few years senior to me, so he ought to have been retired about 10 years ago. So I'm really kind of curious about that storyline, and I want to get some of that candy for myself. But you know, I look at these other things like art. You know, how many seascapes, how many ships, you know, painting? Where does it occupy in our national cultural life? Movies. We did have a great movie a few years ago about the Battle of Midway. It was historically inaccurate, I will say that as a historian, but I loved watching it because the CGI graphics, and also told a great story about Lieutenant Dick Best, one of two men to have sunk 2 aircraft carriers. Dick Best did it in a single day. And then he was put on the sidelines because he was medically disqualified from flying ever again. But he won the Navy Cross for sinking 2 Japanese carriers. I love that part of the story. But we need to have more of that so that the American people and our children get to know these stories. Last year, one of the best-selling movies in China was a movie about Chinese Navy defeating the U.S. Navy at sea. Virtually every young person in China went to see that movie. It was a bestseller. They made billions of yuan doing that movie. When was the last time we made a movie that dealt with wartime themes, where people understand the type of environment that we really are under at this point in time? And I know that's not an easy lift. I also talk about in literature. You know, Tom Clancy wrote a book when I was 18 years old that's still on the bestseller list. How many people are still reading books that deal with naval or maritime themes to this day in popular culture? We need to have events like this where people come out and talk about these types of things. I go to talk to the Kiwanis, I go to talk to the Lions Clubs, I'm at the American Legion. Of course, I'm at the American Legion for lunch twice a week anyways, just to see the guys. But I go and talk with these because I want to tell this story. I hope that all of you try to reach out to your local communities and talk about these types of themes as well in your local groups and meetings, so that it improves our cultural understanding and our societal understanding of the importance of the sea. And of course, in the end, what are we trying to do? We want to avoid having oceans become battlefields once again, because with a $95 trillion global economy, again, with the 70% and 80% by volume and by value, a global maritime war will set back the human species by decades and be highly disruptive. It'll be a tragedy of historical, biblical proportions. So that's it, and I shall now take your questions.
Dr. Jerry Hendrix.
Thank you.
If you'll stand, your name and your question, and I'll hold the microphone.
Okay, Captain, I'm your lawyer here.
Yep.
And as a latter-day Thomas Paine of Common Sense for our Maritime Revolution, here's my question of cross-examination. With an ever-increasing and debilitating budget deficit and national debt, as well as an ever-contracting shipbuilding base for want of a merchant marine, how can the U.S. ever again become a sea power?
So I tend to avoid this exact question. I have people come to me and says, well, how are you going to pay for it? I'm sorry, I just came off of a year where we were talking about Build Back Better with a $6 trillion bill where no one was asking that question. I'm putting forth that we have a national security imperative to do this, and what I'm telling you is I need $40 billion more, not $6 trillion more. We can only get to where we need by reaching a national consensus about who the competitor is and where the environment is that the competition is going to occur and how it will occur. And then at that point in time, I will leave it up to the people who actually, 435 people in one house and 100 people in the other house, to actually come up with where those resources go. But I find it difficult to understand why it is that only the national defense conversation has someone ask, well, how are you going to pay for that? We've done $4 trillion in COVID relief over the last few years. Do I think that was wasted? No. COVID had a dramatic impact upon our country. We've seen our national debt go from $18 trillion to $30 trillion. By the way, $24 trillion of that is in short-term debt that has to be repaid essentially within 1 year bonds. We're facing higher interest rates. We're facing some real problems. Does that lessen the fact that China is growing as a global economic threat or a national security threat at sea? I don't have your solution on where the money comes from. I always tell people that I'm a Eisenhower Republican, which is to say I'm a Republican that'll raise your taxes, because that's what Ike did when he was president. He saw the imperative and he made the decision that we needed to invest in our defense, and he did that as well.
Hi, Dr. Hendrix, Tony Sinegi. What's the origin of the 355 number that you referenced?
Yeah, so 355 was the Obama administration's force structure assessment that occurred in 2015, and they announced it in December of 2016 as the Obama administration was leaving office. It was signed off by Ray Mabus, one of the longest serving secretaries of the Navy in the modern era. He did that by looking at COCOM, Regional Combatant Commander, request for resources, and he dialed up, and I talked with Secretary Mabus on the phone about his decision-making process. And he said, Jerry, we had done a force structure assessment 4 years earlier and arrived at 318. We looked at it and said, are the Chinese more or less of a threat in 2016? It was more. We adjusted our numbers and we arrived at 355. The question he had for me today was, do you believe that China has grown or lessened as a global international threat since 2016? I think it's increased, so therefore your number should be larger.
Thank you. One more question. Have you drilled down and figured out a high-level staffing profile to accommodate the
so part of that $40 billion goes to personnel as well. I think, quite frankly, from a staffing perspective, we're in a great position. Oddly enough, we have more admirals today than we have ships, which is, I think, awkward in public conversations. Mostly the Navy leadership would tell you that's because we now have to fill joint billets, so it's not just purely Navy flag billets like numbered fleet commands and their subordinates. We actually part of joint forces and COCOM things. So, by the way, Mr. Hine, before you leave, this is Jay Hine, who is the president and CEO of the Sagamore Institute, nominally my boss down in Indianapolis with our think tank, and who will be, he's been very supportive of me, and that we're hoping that we will continue to do outreach from Sagamore. So, as I've seen you leave, I want to thank you very much for coming today. So that's my thing is I think from a staffing perspective we're in good shape. However, from a personnel perspective, to man, train, and equip those ships, we will have to grow the number of people in the United States Navy.
Hello, Dr. Hendrix. My name is Carson Keller. A little intimidated. I feel severely underdressed for this occasion, but as a young American who is interested in foreign policy and especially with the structure of the U.S. Navy in the coming years, I would like to ask you a couple questions, but the one I would like to ask you the most is, how would you ideally like to see the 7th Fleet structured to compete with the PLAN when it comes to the actual composition of the assets stationed there, in a time frame that's somewhere close to, say, like the early 2030s?
Okay, great question. Okay, and specifically about putting it in the 2030s. You may note there's two congressmen that I pay a lot of attention to and I talk to a lot. Congressman Gallagher, Wisconsin 8th District, and Elaine Luria in Virginia 2nd District. Both of them have highlighted this thing that we have been talking a long time about, Battle Force 2045. The Navy has this 30-year shipbuilding plan, and we're always talking about the out years. They're saying, hey, what about Battle Force 2025? What is my Navy going to look like in 5 years? Highlighting that in that Admiral Phil Davidson, who was the retiring Indo-Pacific commander, 4-star admiral in charge of the entire Indian Ocean Pacific Regional Combatant Command, projected that China would attempt to seize Taiwan within the next 6 years. That was a year ago, so Taiwan will attempt to seize Taiwan within the next 5 years if we hold with the Davidson window theory. All right, so really this near-term threat is our problem. So that would require us to invest more now in ship repair yards to keep the ships that we have in better shape so that they can extend their lives even as we ramp up construction of new ships. Mind you, we just signed the contract for the new frigate last year. I will not see the first frigate until 2025, 2026, because that's how long it takes to design and build new ships. So your question is what do I need to move, essentially, to confront the Chinese by 2030? I need to move more submarines from the East Coast to the West Coast to ramp them up, because that is my most lethal first-day frontline threat. I need to sink everything that moves within the first 72 hours. And quite frankly, I don't have enough missiles and torpedoes there right now. That's my limiting factor. You can talk about boats all you want. It's the weapons on board them and how long it will take us to empty the magazine. And that will happen very rapidly. I also need to look at moving additional Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, 96 missiles each, to Desron 15 in Japan to ramp that up, because that Desron has both ballistic missile defense of my allies and partners, as well as anti-surface warfare missions that are assigned to it. So those are my first two priorities: fast attack submarines and destroyers.
Thank you, Dr. Hendrix. And just one quick follow-up question. Would you encourage the forward basing of more Third Fleet assets to Pearl Harbor?
I have no problem with Pearl Harbor. I do have real concerns with Guam, because Guam was already within range of several missile systems, both out of North Korea and China. So I would move more things to Pearl Harbor. But one of the problems with Pearl Harbor, for instance, like the Hyman Rickover, is that Pearl Harbor does not have dry dock capacity to hold the new boats. The new Virginia-class boats are larger, they're longer, and there's no infrastructure in place to provide maintenance. I need to make front-loaded infrastructure investments into Pearl Harbor in order for them to take additional ships. Thank you.
Our last question.
Oh, what a privilege. Dr. Hendrix, thanks for a fascinating presentation. Dave Cohn, I've been involved with military affairs here at the club for a number of years. I had the privilege of serving on the USS Illinois Commissioning Committee. I'm currently on the Rickover Commissioning Committee. My question is, I was taken by your comments about reinvigorating American interest in the military and in the Navy specifically and in sea power. I had a conversation recently with an Army veteran who talked about his experience enlisting during the draft in the 1960s as Vietnam was really ramping up, and having a conversation with his father about which service he should enter. And his dad said, well, you might want to consider the Navy, they have better food. He ultimately went with the Army. But my question is...
It's true, though. We do have better food.
Yeah, and my experience aboard vessels has confirmed that. But my observation is that having skin in the game becomes a lot easier if you know that you're going to serve. And so I guess my question is, what do you think of the concept of reinstating some form of compulsory military service or compulsory national service that might refocus Americans' attention on the shared sacrifices we need to make?
Okay, so I'll try to be both serious and light about this, because I grew up with my dad showing me President Johnson's invitation to him to serve, and his subsequent time in the Army during the 1960s. So I understand that from his point. I will tell you, there's a lot of conversations about the idea of reinstituting the draft so that everyone has skin in the game. However, I commanded sailors in an all-volunteer force. Everyone that I had wanted to be there. They volunteered to be there. And I was able to meet all of my requirements for both recruitment and retention during the time that I was on active service. I much rather like dealing with people who want to be there than people who do not want to be there. I will tell you that 90% of my time was spent on 10% of my sailors. They were the ones who were troubled. Okay, that becomes a burden upon commanding officers in trying to train and increase the lethality and the readiness of their force to be dealing with people who don't necessarily want to be there. So I'm in favor of the volunteer force until we reach national crisis. And at that point in time, I think that the American people get behind it, and even the people who are drafted generally understand the importance of that. Historically, you saw that in World War I and World War II, but for the time being, I'm not in favor of a draft. Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, every once in a while we are privileged to have a speaker who just makes time fly, and we could easily spend another hour or more listening to Dr. Hendrix. I think we need to have you back. What do you think?
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
It just happened another presentation to give someday.
As a fellow Midwesterner, we have a small going-away present
All right.
that we know you'll make good use of, a Union League Club
Oh, thank you.
hat and muffler.
Thank you so much.
Welcome.
I have to tell you about the Union League Club. I wanted my wife to come here today, if for no other reason. My wife is a descendant of the Indiana 100th. Her great-grandfather marched with the Indiana 100th under Sherman. And we have his canteen on our mantelpiece in my home in Virginia. So the Union and the Union Army is central to my children's upbringing in their understanding of their family's role and contribution to the nation. So it was a privilege to come to the Union League Club and stay here. I was out with my camera taking pictures of some of the things here, sending home to my wife. She will make the next trip with me to come here, because this is a vital part of our national memory, the understanding of the importance of the Union together. And so I appreciate being here, and I will treasure this. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Again, please remember to visit our website, www.ussrickover.org. We look forward to welcoming you back on March 3rd and for additional programs in the future. Thank you very much.